A seemingly ordinary mobile phone in our time has created a real sensation. Strange animal-like people looked at the cell phone clutched in the guy's hand, their mouths open, as if at the greatest miracle in their lives. This guy's name was Ling Chen. He turned 20 years old this year. He was currently working part-time in a university laboratory, and was currently trying to sell an ordinary telephone as a magical item that would allow people to communicate over vast distances. Initially, the guy participated in an experiment at his university in the laboratory just to gain the points he needed for his studies. This was supposed to be the most ordinary medical study, but at one point the hero was suddenly asked to lie down in a capsule, supposedly to calculate the data on his body. Then the capsule lid closed, gas began to flow. The guy absolutely did not remember what happened next, because he simply lost consciousness immediately. The next moment, Lin already woke up in this strange world, where he was the only surviving person. The local lands were inhabited only by various types of orcs, similar to both people and animals, and to some extent these all types of creatures replaced humanity, due to their diversity and quantity. Let's return to the present moment, where our enterprising guy named Ling Chen was trying to sell modern mobile phones to these strange creatures. The locals were greatly impressed by such a thing, common to us and strange to them, which also made funny sounds, which amused the children and frightened the adults. The hero stood at the head of this entire auction, surrounded by two beast-like beauties on both sides. He understood perfectly well what opportunities were now opening up for him, because there were still a lot of modern gadgets left in the world, about which the local people understand absolutely nothing. For example, they could use cell phones as armor by simply tying flaps of them to their arms. For most herbivores, books were generally a favorite delicacy, so they were used as a delicacy on the dinner table. Absolutely everything that this enterprising guy offered sold like hotcakes at such auctions. All he had time to do was raise the price of each product higher all the time, which he was immensely happy about. Usually the auctions were fairly fair, but everywhere there are people who want to get everything at once and for free. So some company came to today's auction, standing behind and constantly interfering in the ongoing auction. However, the people gathered here were horrified, because these were not just villains, but the leader of a formidable local gang. At the beginning of it stood a bear, which was so huge that it towered at least twice as tall as everyone else. Its face was covered in scars. Around his neck he wore a necklace of defeated other predators. His retinue was not much kinder. This bear unceremoniously grabbed the poor guy by the collar, lifted him into the air, and threw him into the hands of his charge. His panther henchman began to threaten the unfortunate herbivore, forcing him to give up his one lot. This situation terrified all the other animals gathered here, because they understood that this guy could no longer be saved. And they were absolutely right, because the panther threw the blond man to the ground and began to threaten him with violence. The guy had already given up and begged for mercy, agreeing to even give away all his winnings for free. However, the face of the one-eyed panther expressed not only the desire to win, but also to enjoy the villainy itself. He raised his huge foot with claws right above the poor guy's chest, ready to lower it at any moment. The guy already understood that these were his last moments of life in this world. Tears flowed down his face. Not even a couple of seconds had passed before the predator's huge paw fell on the unfortunate man's chest, crushing him. Having finished his work, the panther calmly moved on, leaving bloody trails behind him. The poor boy, who was no longer with us in this world, was simply left behind lying in a pool of blood. This trio madly frightened everyone gathered here not only by their appearance, but also by the fact that they also enjoyed murder. All of them not only wanted to cause harm, but always tried to do as much evil as possible in their path, which brought them pleasure. The most terrible among them was, of course, the bear, which sometimes deliberately took victims for itself just like that. For the sake of mockery, he threw one unfortunate coin on the table and was about to collect all the goods. His henchmen were just walking around and collecting all the things they had won from other animals. It was the turn of the telephone, which remained lying on the table. The panther reached out his paw to this strange object, but suddenly at the last moment the seller himself appeared in front of him. The young guy simply immediately moved the phone away from the bandit and slapped him on the hand, as if showing that they would not get anything here. The panther tried to threaten with words at first, but the guy reacted to everything with a smile and was clearly not afraid of it. Then the panther tried to attack the young seller, intending to hit him right in the face. However, when the blow almost touched the guy's body, he suddenly disappeared. There was definitely no one around the table and the panther, just empty ground. The bandit was shocked at how the guy managed to disappear so quickly. After all, in reality the villain was one of the fastest animals in the whole world. But even he could not keep up with the speed of this young seller. Only some strange glow suddenly appeared right in front of him for a second, and then disappeared just as quickly. Another strange object fell from it exactly where the boy had just been. The head bear began to look around, trying to find the missing person. The remaining residents also could not understand what had just happened here. Panther even more so, because although he was fast, he was a little dull. Deciding that it didn't matter where the boy went, the main thing was that now they could take all his things. The bandits continued to rob the locals. Therefore, they immediately grabbed both phones that were left lying on the table unattended. The chief bear and his henchmen were very happy about such a good catch. They had never seen such funny little things in the whole world. They turned them over in their hands, trying to understand how to use them. Surprisingly, the priest was the first to think of trying to press on the strange protuberances that were on this object. He heard some sounds coming from a strange object, and brought it to his ear to hear it better, and there some pretty female voice began to talk to him. It was the same girl who stood next to our cellar just recently, and disappeared even earlier. She told the villain that, unfortunately, the balance on his account was 0 and if they wanted to continue using cellular communications, then they had to pay in money. The guys did not understand at all what the beautiful girl meant, whose voice came from this strange object. The girl told them to bring the money to the old laboratory building before a certain day, but then she simply hung up. Lying on her lap at that moment was the very same seller who had magically disappeared from the auction itself. The girl finished the conversation, turned off the headset, and took it off her head. She sighed tiredly. After such a difficult mission and a very unpleasant conversation with the bandits, she asked the guy who had been quietly lying on her lap all this time about the quality of the work done. He praised her, saying that the work was done perfectly. He was glad that their plan worked perfectly, just as they wanted. The girl looked at our hero with adoration, enjoying every minute spent with him. Lin, seeing that the money had arrived in the account, decided to teach those evil bandits a lesson. He grinned, said that villains should always get what they deserve, and decided to deceive them. He pressed the big red button on his remote control, which activated the cell phone's self-destruct mechanism. The phone at that very moment literally exploded right in the hand of the stunned panther. All that was left of him was a small burning lump of useless circuits that slowly burned out on the ground. This brought the bandits into a real rage and made them burn with anger. The panther promised to take revenge on our hero for such humiliation, but the couple didn't really care. At that moment they were calmly walking around the laboratory. The girl was amazed at how smart her partner turned out to be. They walked to the control center of the laboratory, and at that moment the guy was thinking through another plan on how he could restore electricity throughout the center and gain even more power. Then the girl began to remember how she met this guy and how he freed her from captivity. She remembered that it was just another day in the strange world of bestial people, or humanoid animals. The monotonous ringing of thick chains was heard throughout the area, binding the wrists of creatures walking along the road and sounding exactly in time with their steps, slow from fatigue. All of them were dressed in torn, faded clothes under the scorching sun, which they no longer protected the wind, but only hung in rags on their bodies. But among all those walking, one girl stood out with her horns and spotted dress, a cow named Ellie, as she imagined herself. The girl was very dirty, tired because of the long time spent on the road by the same unfortunate creatures like her, who, like her, had nothing to lose. In the world of the weak and the strong, they were all very lucky that they did not become prey to those who were much more dangerous and could have eaten them. Our cow Ellie was one of those who suffered a different fate, because instead of being eaten, she ended up in exile along with other herbivores. Then everyone noticed that the overall pace of movement had decreased due to the fact that those in front of this crowd had bumped into something. It was an institute standing in the middle of a barren place where no grass grew, where there was no visible food for our poor driven animals, only a strange structure of glass and concrete. It really was an exile, because the creatures were simply collected in one place, where there was nothing at all, only bare walls, and abandoned to the mercy of fate, abandoned by everyone and could only wait for inevitable death. Ellie understood perfectly well that the same fate awaited her ahead as was in store for everyone else who surrounded her in such a strange and frighteningly dark place. But fortunately, the priest was instructed by someone who called himself the local viceroy and managed to find a certain altar. In the middle of the silence of the hangar, a strange sound was heard, then a hissing and, at first weak, but with each minute gaining more and more strength, the light began to penetrate the darkness of the locked space. Then the viceroy found his altar and opened the door to what almost became a cemetery for hundreds of still living beings, and instantly gave them hope of salvation. Everyone was confused, afraid to rejoice ahead of time, but they understood that now their lives were in the hands of their savior or destroyer. And he, meanwhile, looked down at the creatures sitting and trembling in horror, smiled and tried to explain to them their new way of life, if, of course, they were interested in this life at all. All those who obeyed were immediately fed with very strange and incomprehensible-looking food from boxes brought by the minions of their new commander. The head still stood nearby and monitored the process of distributing rations, without ceasing every now and then to issue some new instructions to his assistants. He forced the creatures to divide into groups of several in each, then only they were given a box for everyone and moved on to the next similar group, sitting nearby, waiting for their portion. The head constantly called himself the vicegerent in front of the animals, repeating that all this was his will and now the suffering owed him their lives. He forced them to reverently bow their heads to the ground in a bow, to freeze in this position for several minutes, until he himself gave them the go-ahead and finally allowed them to rise. And all the creatures, from small to large, all of them bowed their heads not out of respect, but out of fear and gratitude to the one who gave them hope for further life, who saved them from starvation at that moment. And the governor looked at all this and rejoiced at his power over the poor and unfortunate creatures who did not yet realize the fate prepared for them. The priest told everyone that only the viceroy could understand the word of God and tell everyone how to deal with God in order to receive food. Thus came relative peace and tranquility in the new strange lands, where all the rejected ones settled, and the creatures took turns helping with the distribution of food allocated to everyone and cleaning. So our cow was performing her duties for the first time with another girl when she suddenly heard a cry for help. Ellie's partner tried to calm the girl down with words, to convince her that she shouldn't pay attention to the strange screams. The governor was just a little furious, but no one was in danger, and it was better to just quietly go on with her own business and not interfere with other people's. And with this she managed to persuade the cow because, that although she wanted to help, she still understood that she could not cope on her own, and could only bring the wrath of the governor on her own head, and certainly no one would rush to save her after this. And at that moment the priest pressed the head of the poor maid with his dirty foot to the ground, forcing her to fall to her knees and sit there, pretending to be a footstool and trembling with fear. His own power drove him crazy, forced him to literally cross the boundaries of what was permitted, devour food reserves intended for poor creatures, drink bottles of alcohol, and humiliate the weak in every possible way. He looked at the girl at his feet and laughed right in her face, justifying his behavior with the orders of God, which he did not dare disobey. The priest and his men took most of the food for themselves, but everyone was still very grateful to him, because even such a life of constant malnutrition, beatings, service and fear was in the understanding of creatures much better than death from wild hunger and some strange cold and dark hangar among strangers. The cow agreed with the majority, and, having already forgotten about the poor thing in need of help in the governor's room and his henchmen, she calmly looked after the flowers in her room. Every day she prayed to the merciful God that he saved her and gave her food, water, shelter, that he allowed such a pitiful cow like her to continue to live. However, she could not close her eyes to the conversations that had long been circulating among the same creatures living with her under one big roof. The girl heard more and more often that the governor and his assistants were becoming more and more impudent, taking more food for themselves than before, and more often mocking the servants who brought them this food and serviced their homes. Therefore, she was not only grateful for the life given to her, but also asked the Lord God to make this very life a little better, a little easier, to control the head of the priest and his company a little. And then one day her prayer was heard, because the creatures who were on duty this time near God in anticipation of new food informed everyone about the miracle that had occurred. When the doors opened, instead of food there was some strange creature on the table that did not look like any of the animals, did not have a tail, or any horns or ears on its head. Of course, those on duty immediately sent people for the priest to come and try to talk to God, to find out what happened, where their food was, what kind of creature was sent to them today. The animals were both terrified and afraid, but they were wildly curious about what or who it was that was lying on the table, why God sent it to them, where was their food. Everyone was waiting for the governor's decision, looking at him with questions, proposing various options for the development of events, but still waiting for the final decisions from him. The dignitary was in thought because he still could not decide how to get out of this situation without revealing his deception that he had not communicated with any god all this time. Finally, he came up with the idea to take all the foreign creatures away from here, give them food, distract them from this strange person, which would give him more time to cope with this situation. Therefore, all the animals were simply gifted with mountains of food that they had never received before. They were forced to grab as much food as they could carry themselves and immediately disperse from the hangar to their homes, while the governor dealt with the problem that had arisen. Therefore, everyone immediately began to fuss, and after a few seconds, not even minutes, there was no trace of anyone in the room. When all the creatures finally left and the door closed behind them, only our familiar cow remained next to the governor. She looked around and didn't understand what to eat and remake, where to put the remaining food, what to do with this strange creature lying on the table. But the governor had his own plan, which he wanted to use, and this very plan implied the participation of the poor cow. Therefore, the priest approached Shelley, put his hand on her shoulder, bent down to her ears, and began to whisper a new decree, hiding behind the command of the Lord. What Ellie heard did not make her happy at all, rather even frightened her. The girl began to tremble finely. A chill ran through her skin. It even seemed to her that the room suddenly became colder. The governor took her hand in his palms and placed a knife in them, which appeared as if by magic right out of thin air. He leaned even lower to Ellie's head and ordered her to take this knife and stick it into this strange creature lying on the table, killing it before it woke up, because that was God's order. Ellie looked at the tip of the knife, at the way it sparkled under the light, and this filled her with real horror, because she had never killed anyone before, had been a herbivore all her life and had never harmed a single living creature. At this time, the priest stood up, stepped back a couple of steps, and once again reminded the cow that she lives here by the will of God, and therefore is obliged to do everything that God requires of her in return. He said that now everything is only in her hands, and he can watch the execution of the order through the camera, being in another room, so she won't be able to simply escape. The deputy left, leaving Ellie standing alone in the room, holding tightly in her hands the knife with which she was now about to harm another creature for the first time in her life. Ellie stood as if frozen, and was brought to her senses only by the disgusting and drawn-out sound of the door closing behind the departed priest. Only after that the girl raised her head and finally looked at the strange creature that was lying on the table, sent by God. Now the cow was convinced that this creature was definitely alive, because it began to make various sounds and clearly gradually came to its senses, about to threaten to wake up. There was not a moment to lose if Ellie truly wanted to carry out God's order and kill this creature rather than be punished for disobeying the order. She looked at the knife in her hands and did not understand what she really should do. She was frightened by its sharpness, and in the reflection from the surface she saw herself. The cow looked again at the strange creature lying on the table and came a few steps closer to it. The creature was clearly in pain. He was clearly missing something. He felt bad, and Ellie didn't even know whether she should help her or quickly get him out of his torment. Ellie came closer to God and tried to read what he wanted to tell her, but only became convinced that only the governor could understand God's orders, because she could not make out any of the written words. Still, she felt sorry for this poor creature in pain, so Ellie put the knife behind her back, thinking that in this state no one would harm her, and came closer, almost close, to the table. She leaned over the creature's body, trying to understand what was wrong with it. Then she climbed onto the table to get as close as possible to the creature's head and try to understand if maybe it wanted and was trying to talk to her about something. The creature was clearly cold, so Ellie climbed on top of it, trying to warm it with the warmth of her own body. The cow experienced some strange sensation. At the same time she was scared. She felt sorry for this poor creature lying here in agony, but at the same time it evoked some new feelings in her body. His face was covered with sweat from tension, grimaced in pain. His body continued to make sounds of agony. Ellie turned to God, trying to find out how she could help this strange creature. Suddenly an unexpected idea came to her mind, which confused her, because it was a very incomprehensible action for her. Not fully understanding what was happening, Ellie leaned closer to the face of the strange creature and began to gradually approach it. She looked at his lips, which every now and then opened and closed back, giving out new portions of warm breath each time. The girl closed her eyes and gradually began to bring her lips closer and closer to the lips of this strange creature. Finally, she covered his mouth with hers, and their tongues intertwined as if in a strange dance, which at another moment would have greatly puzzled Ellie. But now she was completely absorbed in the process and did not pay attention to anything around her. The girl took the creature's face in her hands and tried to press her lips against it as hard as possible, and their tongues moved faster and faster, intertwined together. After some time, Ellie finally took her face away from this strange creature and tried to look at it again. Some incomprehensible feeling grew inside her, and at one glance at this creature, it intensified with every second. The sudden creature moved its arms and tried to pull them as high as possible to its head, as if something there was bothering it. Immediately next to the table, out of nowhere, the same small table appeared, on which stood an empty ordinary glass on top. Ellie was confused, did not fully understand what God wanted from her. She tried to ask him about it, but she never received anything in response. Suddenly a thought came to her mind, because if there is a glass, then something needs to be poured into it, and perhaps in this way God was trying to tell her that the creature did not have enough water. However, the cow did not have any water with her, and there was no water standing next to her, and God gave him a glass, but did not give him anything to pour into it. And then Ellie remembered that she was, after all, a cow, which means she had her own milk. The girl was a little embarrassed, but she understood that perhaps God was counting on this by giving her this glass, that she would figure it out herself. Ellie was absolutely embarrassed to pour her milk into a glass in front of strangers, but the creature clearly needed help and very urgently. This decision was not easy, but she still thought that she still had nowhere to go, and there was no need to wait for help. So the girl made up her mind, which she informed the deity about. She looked down once again at this strange creature she was sitting on, wondering how best she could do this. The situation itself definitely made the girl nervous, because she rarely found herself in such situations. But there was nothing left to do but help this poor creature, because with every second his face was distorted from pain more and more. It seemed that a little more, and he would never be able to come to his senses. So the cow got off the table, walked a little further away from him, turned away from the camera and began to untie her dress, raising her hands up. The girl loosened the ties around her neck, lowered the collar of her spotted robe in front, and leaned her chest over the glass. It only took a little effort, a little pressure on her chest, for fresh milk to start pouring out, filling the glass to the brim. After which Ellie took the drink in her hands, walked up to the strange creature and leaned the glass against his lips. The girl watched as the creature began to slowly absorb her own milk, which at the same time confused her and aroused other new feelings in her. The creature had already drunk more than half a glass of milk, but still did not come to its senses. So Ellie began to worry that she had understood or done something wrong. After lying there for a few more minutes, the creature finally began to come to its senses, opening first one eye, then the second, and then both at the same time. It looked straight ahead, then looked at Ellie, trying to say something. Everything swam before the creature's eyes, spinning in all directions, not allowing him to concentrate on what was happening and finally come to his senses. The girl was very glad that this strange creature had finally come to her senses. Tears even appeared in her eyes from happiness, and a smile lit up her face and did not leave it. While the cow was sitting on her knees on the table, the guy finally fully came to his senses, raised himself on his elbows, tried to take a more comfortable position and sit down. He looked at the girl who was sitting very close to him, not fully understanding what was going on, how she ended up here. And she, in turn, looked at him with a smile and waited for further actions, not doing anything herself yet, but giving the creature time to come to its senses. Then it finally dawned on the guy that this was not all a dream, but was happening in reality, that the girl was also sitting in front of him for real. The hero began to look around, not understanding at all where he was, how he got here. Then he became interested in the girl's appearance, her strange clothes, her ropes on her hands, the bell on her neck, her horns. And while the guy was coming to his senses, our cow, following the rules of decency, began to tell him that her name was Ellie, that she was 16 years old, that she was from Scotland. The hero did not fully understand what she was talking about, what kind of live cows were, thinking that it was all a joke. But still, he decided to play along with this strange girl for now, because he didn't fully understand what was going on around him and was hoping for her help. He introduced himself, said that he was a man, calling himself by the name Lingchen or simply Ling, said that he worked here, and began asking about some completely unfamiliar people to the girl. From all this, our cow understood practically nothing, only that this strange creature turned out to be a real person, a guy named Lin, who spoke very strangely. The girl simply repeated words unfamiliar to her, hoping that the guy would be able to explain to her what it meant, but in fact, she did not understand anything at all, and what he was saying. The hero was also not happy about being stuck in some unfamiliar place with a strange cow who didn't understand anything. Then the guy noticed that he was still lying on the table in his laboratory, and the computer behind him began to glow strangely. It turned out that the computer generated a program error, which led to the guy waking up prematurely. The process of awakening was precisely a kiss, which was given to him literally quite recently by this stunning girl dressed as a cow. Then the hero saw an empty glass and thought that it was standing there for a reason, and perhaps was connected with his awakening. Lin took it in his hands, began to examine it more carefully, and came across the remains of a white liquid, which after a couple of moments he recognized as milk. He began to remember that the girl had fed him something from a glass while he was unconscious. The hero decided to clarify this point with the girl sitting next to him, who was looking at him with a very interested look. He asked what was previously poured into this glass, whether it was cow's milk by chance, and the girl happily answered that in fact there was unusual cow's milk in this glass, but her own milk, because she is also a cow. Then the guy gave a completely strange and unusual reaction to these words of hers. He ran up to the girl, put his hands forcefully on her shoulders and enthusiastically began to thank her for such a seemingly trifle. He began to talk some nonsense about responsibility, that he would take responsibility. But what kind of responsibility? The girl still could not understand. She tried to get some explanation from him about how and why he would take responsibility. The guy raised his head, looked the girl straight in the eyes, saying that before taking responsibility, he needed to see everything with his own eyes. Ellie was confused and absolutely did not understand what he was talking about, what he needed to be convinced of, but she was ready to help him in everything, because it was God's will. Lin took the girl's horns in his hands and began to examine them, touching them this way and that. The guy ran his fingers up and down the girl's horns, walked in circles, and gently touched behind the ear. Ellie had never allowed anyone to touch her there before, so the sensations were unfamiliar to her, but at the same time they were very pleasant and embarrassing. Why did the hero walk around the back of the cow, trying to examine it from all angles, which made the girl shudder from his gaze? Then he turned around and walked towards the luminous screen, which was located on the wall, starting to read something there and pronounce out loud words incomprehensible to the cow. The girl was shocked that someone besides the governor could understand what was written there, and therefore could talk with God. Moreover, he addressed God with some strange name Siri, after which he began to calmly answer him, as if obeying orders. The hero put his hand to the wall, after which an imprint was left on it, and symbols began to change on the blue glowing screen. Ellie simply stood in shock at what was happening, not fully understanding how this strange guy who calls himself a real person can talk to God without being a priest. However, the guy shocked her even more by calling the mysterious God, who had previously given all creatures food, shelter, water, just an ordinary computer. The girl was even more amazed that the guy could easily control this very computer, getting everything he asked for. The hero finally, thanks to the computer, found out that it is now 195th year after the extinction of humanity, which he was very surprised by. It turned out that he was the last person left on the whole earth, and this place was called a kind of ark in which creatures survived. The hero could not believe the changes that had taken place and did not understand how he ended up here and how he should proceed. Ellie, at that moment, watched the conversation between a man and a computer and was amazed that God answered him. Although she did not understand a word, she nevertheless understood that they were communicating. At that moment, in another room, a local priest was watching them on security cameras. He sat at the control panel, looked at the screen, saw with his own eyes the entire scene of a person awakening from beginning to end. However, he didn't know that this strange man was actually communicating with the computer now because the camera was silent. The governor looked at Ellie and did not understand why she had not yet killed this strange creature, but rather stood and talked to him. In a wild and uncontrollable rage, he screamed at the image and forcefully pressed the huge red button, which in turn was supposed to make the people under the cameras pay attention to them. When the priest realized that Ellie was not going to do anything, he gave the order to his minions to go to the man and finish the job on their own. After all, he understood that this man was in fact the greatest danger to them and a threat to their rule, because he could tell everyone else the truth, and then the priest would lose his power. At this time, in the room with the computer, Ellie looked in fascination at the strange man who continued to talk to the blue screen. Finally, the girl remembered the priest's order and reached behind her back, trying to feel the knife there. She pulled the weapon out of her back, looked at it for a long time and could not understand what she should do. And yet, fear of the governor won in her. The girl took the knife in both hands, pointed the tip towards the guy and slowly and quietly began to move towards his back. Suddenly, some strange iron tentacles began to approach the girl herself from all sides, but she walked, not noticing anything around her, focused only on the moment of the murder. But the guy realized that something was going wrong when the computer gave him a warning about the danger and automatic activation of protection, which forced him to turn around. During these short moments, the tentacles managed to completely disarm the girl. They wrapped her entire body, including her legs, arms, and made several turns around her waist. The tentacles forced the girl to freeze in place, raise her hands up, being truly horrified by what was happening, because she understood absolutely nothing. The guy noticed all this and was wildly surprised by what was happening, not understanding what made the girl attack him from behind. The knife that had fallen from Ellie's hands lay on the floor, attracting the attention of both those present here, both girls and boys. The cow realized that she had nowhere to go, and tried to explain to our hero why she decided to do this, what made her attack him. The girl said that their local deputy of God forced her to do this, threatening her with punishment and hunger for disobedience to the orders of the Lord. Lin listened to her story very carefully, still amazed at how everyone here was intimidated by calling an ordinary computer some kind of omnipotent deity. Also, the guy did not understand at all where the most standard computer, which just this morning did not stand out from the rest in any way, had such strange functions of some kind of protection against the detected threat. How did these tentacle countries end up here, which no one has ever programmed? How do they themselves understand who to grab, who is a threat? Ellie was so upset by what was happening that she could not hold back her tears because of her remorse for this strange guy. The girl, bound by iron tentacles, looked at the guy she had just tried to kill, cried and begged him for forgiveness. She kept repeating something about Priest Lu, about the Viceroy of God on earth, and Lin listened to her and did not understand at all what she meant. Meanwhile, the tentacles began to squeeze Ellie more and more, clasping her chest, waist, other limbs, wrapping around the girl's torso. This added even more pain to the cow's body, causing her to scream from the discomfort caused by the strange iron tentacles. The girl asked our hero for mercy, so that he would save her from this torment, and finally, lower her to the ground. Lin shook himself out of his daze and walked over to the glowing blue computer screen and entered a command, ordering it to remove the tentacles, indicating that the threat had passed. After this, the iron tentacles immediately released our cow's limbs, causing her to fall onto the cold concrete floor. The girl was on her knees while her body was left with red marks from how tightly her skin had been squeezed and tied. The cow was still trembling with fear that she had just lost her life, but she was also worried that she had just tried to kill such a beautiful person. And our kind guy tried, even after everything that had happened, to calm the poor girl down, coming closer to her, extending his hand to her head. The hero carefully wiped away the tears of the crying cow, said a couple of encouraging words to her, also pointing out that he did not hold any grudges or anger towards her, because he perfectly understood that she acted under pressure. He promised the girl that with him she would have nothing to fear, that he would help them all get rid of the rule of a certain strange priest Lu, who kept all the local people in fear. These words seemed to cheer up our cow a little. She even looked up at her savior, whom she herself almost killed, and tried to smile, and the tears stopped flowing from her eyes. Lin, meanwhile, was thinking about how they could lure this priest out into the open, how they could tell all the creatures inhabiting this ark about his tricks. But he didn't have to think long, because the door to their laboratory opened on its own and clearly nothing good was waiting for them behind it. And he was absolutely right, because two big men appeared from behind the door, serving the local governor, and they clearly did not have the best intentions here. As soon as they entered, they immediately conveyed the priest's message to the guys that he knew very well that the cow obeyed his order, for which she would definitely be punished later. The poor girl, who had already suffered enough fear today, looked from this pig to his bat, covered with sharp iron spikes, and back. The second pig was already imagining what a wonderful punishment he would perform tonight with this girl somewhere alone. Ellie kept screaming and begging for mercy. It seemed as if she was ready to cry again. But suddenly our hero stepped forward, stretched out his hand, as if protecting the poor cow from attacks from these terrible pigs of the governor's henchmen. Ellie was incredibly grateful to this kind guy, who not only forgave her for trying to kill him, but was also ready to protect her from Priest Lu and his henchmen. But the guy thought that this would be a great opportunity to find out what was really going on here, who these people were, what he should do next, and whether there was an opportunity to return to his home. So he looked at Ellie again, then turned to the big man, took a few steps forward, crossed his arms over his chest and began a serious conversation with them. The guy was not afraid of anything at all. On the contrary, he behaved as if he were the master of the situation here, asked questions, and commanded the two big men in every possible way. And the two pigs, in turn, were very surprised by the strange behavior of this guy, because they were used to being afraid of them all the time, and not standing with an important look and trying to give commands here. After the guy called himself a real messenger of God, the pigs looked at each other, grinned, thinking that this was some kind of nonsense, and there could be no one else besides their real viceroy. Lost in a semi-rage, one of the pigs revealed the main secret of their company, that in fact there is no God, and the priest simply summons food from this strange glowing blue hole every time. This surprised Ellie very much. She tried to stop the angry flow of this creature and asked clarifying questions about why then they should all obey the governor. Our hero Lin was simply discouraged by such another stupid thing that these two big guys said, giving away all the most important secrets of their boss. And the guys themselves also already realized that they had said something unnecessary, so they suddenly fell silent and tried to pretend that none of this had happened. The only survivor, in turn, said that either the priest had fooled everyone, including these pigs, or they knew everything and were his accomplices. And in any case, it doesn't matter whether they knew about what was happening or not, whether the priest believes in the existence of God, but this very man standing before them now is his true messenger. The guy decided to demonstrate his strength to everyone present, so he asked Siri to turn off the lights in the room, which happened instantly. This made a very strong impression on everyone who was in this laboratory, because none of them, not even the vicegerent of God himself, could do this. Then the guy made light appear in the room, but not in the whole room, but to direct all the rays to opposite places. First, he made one pig glow, then he made the second pig glow, from which they were simply in real horror, not understanding what was happening, fearing that this strange light would hurt them. Seeing such a frightened reaction, Lin made the light rotate in a circle, then suddenly braked in one place, directing it only at himself, as if it were a spotlight. The guy guessed that he could use the whole situation to his advantage, so he made a heartfelt speech about how this hole, which had previously given them food, was in fact not God, but just his servant. Since he controls this servant, that means he himself is a real God, so he knows for sure that Priest Lu was a deceiver because he himself did not send anyone. His speech made an indelible impression on everyone who could observe it, making them believe everything he said at that very second. Lin said that he had been watching them from above all this time and did not like that someone was using his name to their advantage, so he decided to go down himself, after which the pigs began asking rather stupid questions to our hero. In the end, he got tired of it, so our guy said that there were enough questions for today and it was time to get back to talking about the priest. However, something distracted our hero and forced him to interrupt his speech mid-sentence. In fact, he just saw with what reverence the local little beautiful cow was looking at him, with what trepidation she listened and caught his every word. The guy definitely liked this attention from the girl, but he still decided not to be distracted by it for now, but to focus on the negotiations. But the cow continued to look at her hero with a look full of gratitude, admiring his strength. One of the pigs believed our hero's story completely and began to question the powers of the priest himself. His second partner did not like this very much, who recalled that their boss had warned them about this from the beginning. They were immediately told that even though this guy could use magic, it still meant absolutely nothing. He managed to convince his white-haired partner that he had been misled. He must remember why they came here in the first place. Therefore, the pigs raised their weapons belligerently, emitted a surrounding key, and prepared to attack our hero. They rushed at him with such fury that the guy thought that he might actually be in serious danger if he allowed them to touch him. For a second he even froze in place, not knowing what to do next, how he could defend himself against these two big men, because he was unarmed. But then he remembered the new security system of this laboratory, which he had just recently become acquainted with when a cow tried to attack him with a knife. He shouted to Siri, summoning those protective iron tentacles, snapping his fingers for added effect. When the tentacles appeared, our hero pointed his finger at these two big guys, ordering them to allegedly grab the villains. Of course, the iron defenders of the laboratory headed straight towards the two creatures that posed a direct threat. They, just recently the cow, tried to wrap their arms around these two pigs, simultaneously squeezing them and preventing them from moving. However, the pigs were still much stronger than some poor little cow. Therefore, one of the big men was able to break out of these iron shackles, raised his arms with his weapon up, and shouted menacingly, trying to give a belligerent look to his appearance. This seriously frightened our hero, because he understood that apart from these iron tentacles he had no more protection. Meanwhile, the pig, in a rage, rushed at our guy, trying to get him and kill him, as their boss, Priest Lu, ordered them to do. Lin rushed to escape from the attacker, trying to gain at least a little time until some other defensive measure came to his mind. The computer at that moment reported that eliminating the threat through the iron tentacles could be completed earlier due to the fact that the equipment was old, and asked our hero if he needed any alternative protection. At that time, the pig was running after our hero, trying to catch up with him, furious that he had been subjected to such humiliation. In the meantime, the computer reported that this version may have some errors. It should be monitored with the guard. And then Lin was surprised, because he had never heard of any of the guards before, did not understand where to look, what they were all about. And then it dawned on him that perhaps the name guard meant the same cow that helped him wake up from sleep, thereby fulfilling the role of this very guard. Looking at his friend Ellie, the guy came up with a great idea, which he had previously seen in some video game, so he tried to call up a new level of protection. After which the piggy began to be surrounded by some strange objects that crawled out of the walls directly on the orders of the mysterious guy. Moreover, these strange objects scared the big man much more than the previous ones, because they were clearly hard, sharp, and could cause him real harm. He had never seen such strange devices before or even heard of their existence. And then there were the most ordinary circular saws, some rifles, electric shockers and much more from the modern world. Ambal did not understand what was happening, but he understood that he would be in trouble if he allowed these strange things to touch him, so he was forced to retreat. However, the buzzsaw followed him wherever he went, cornering him and making him feel unsafe. Suddenly a voice came from the direction of the door, causing everyone to freeze and turn their attention to him. The big guys turned their heads towards the entrance with hope, because they recognized the voice of their mentor, hoping that he would save them right away. And our couple of heroes looked at the priest and waited for his next step, which could decide a lot at the moment. The governor actually turned out to be huge, completely different from what our hero imagined him to be. He stood opposite the passage and absolutely nothing was visible behind him. He was so big. Lin's guess that this was Priest Lu was only confirmed after Ellie called him that. But the guy still decided to clarify whether this strange creature, a huge pig, the likes of which he had never seen before, was really a priest. While they were having a conversation, the big men fell to their knees and began plaintively crawling towards their boss, trying to beg for forgiveness. They described everything that had just happened here, pressing for pity, trying to save their skins from the wrath of the governor. They also said that this strange guy called himself God and Lu a liar. The governor listened to all this with a blank expression on his face, at the same time trying to understand how best to act further in the current situation, so as not to get into trouble himself. After which he suddenly fell to his knees, bowed his head to the ground, extended his hands forward, and began to ask and beg forgiveness from our hero, calling him the real God. This put his henchmen into a real shock, and our cow was also very surprised, and the guy was simply glad that his trick worked, and now he was safe. Of course, this was all a huge trick on the part of the governor, who was just trying to avoid punishment for the evil he had done. Night had already fallen outside the window, and this huge pig, bowing his head, called on our hero, whom he now called God and nothing else, to kill these two of his former assistants who attacked him. He asked the hero to get rid of these two ill-mannered, ungrateful pigs as soon as possible. His assistants were simply shocked by such words, because they believed him to the last, carried out all his orders, listened to his every will, and considered it the only true one. They were outraged that this was going to be done to them in exchange for all their loyalty to the priest up until that very moment. But the huge pig didn't really want to listen to them, picking up a weapon, trying to finish what he started himself, although no one except him still understood why he needed this. The governor ordered his former two subordinates to shut up and boldly accept the punishment they deserved for all the deeds he had done. He admitted to himself that there really was no God, but he only recently saw with his own eyes how this guy ran from the big guy all over the room. Then with his magic he summoned a weapon right out of the air. He was used to believing his own eyes more. Therefore, he thought that this strange guy could use the most ancient magic, which absolutely no one in this world could use. And this meant something, so the huge piggy first watched the hero from afar, secretly envious of his strength, dreaming of taking it for himself and becoming a real god in this arc. And at the moment he was trying to curry favor with this guy, hoping to later receive some benefit for his location. Therefore, he pretended that he knew nothing about the words of these two pathetic pigs, trying to kill them as quickly as possible before they completely ruined his entire plan. But at the last moment he was stopped by the young god, and Lin at that moment grabbed the cow by the arm, helped her up, helped her stand on straight legs, because sitting on the cold floor is dangerous. The guy said that he did not originally plan to kill anyone, and did not want the now former priest Lu to take this initiative and carry it out. These words forced the governor to lower his weapon to the ground and throw it away, abandoning attempts to kill his former subordinate. He bowed his head in another apology to the young god, trying to gain his approval again. Our hero turned to the computer with an order to cancel the protection system, because the threat had already passed, which means it could be turned off. The computer immediately obeyed the young hero, removing the iron tentacles into the walls, where they had come from before. After that, the white-haired pig found himself free, fell to his knees from exhaustion, and tried to catch his breath after the mess that had happened. Meanwhile, the former priest noticed that every time the boy uses magic, he says a code word and looks at the blue screen, as if reading a spell on it, which means he needs to remember this very word in order to continue using it himself. Suddenly, some kind of wild fatigue pierced our hero through and through. His head ached, his legs began to give way. In order not to fall, he leaned on his familiar cow, the only one he could somehow trust here, especially since she was very soft. The girl was frightened by what had happened. She was afraid that something had happened to the guy. Maybe he was in pain and needed some kind of help. However, Lin said that it was just hunger after waking up, that he needed to eat a little, rest, and he would be fine, as if he were brand new. The computer system offered him a choice of set meals of beef or pork. However, this seemed slightly unethical to the guy, because here in the same room with him there were representatives of pigs and representatives of cows, which made it a little awkward to eat their kind in front of them. However, the hero thought that they never had to taste each other's meat anyway, because they were all herbivores, so there would be no problems. He chose several set meals, deciding to serve them to everyone gathered here as a gesture of goodwill, showing that he no longer held a grudge against them, while at the same time deciding to surprise them with one more magic. The pigs gobbled up the food on both cheeks. They really liked the crispy crust on the burgers, because they had never eaten anything like that before. The cow quickly became delighted with the small pieces of strange food, which was very similar to beef kebab, but she did not need to know about it, she simply enjoyed the taste. The former priest was also sitting nearby and eating some kind of hot dog, but the only thing in his mind was that he wanted to take all the strength of this guy for himself and create such miracles on his own. And our hero looked at the creatures sitting around him and tried to understand who they were. Were they more animals or such strange people? Because before he had never seen anything like them. Lin examined his familiar cow from head to toe, paying attention to her collar hanging on her neck to her chest, from which he had just recently drunk milk, to her horns, ears, and tail, which dangled from side to side. He then approached Ellie directly and asked if he could check her body one more time from all angles because he needed to look at something. Meanwhile, the former priest coughed into his fist, trying to attract the attention of those gathered here for this wonderful meal. It was just another way to suck up to the new god, namely to thank him for this wonderful food, for his favor, for his kindness, hoping to win him over. Without waiting for his former henchmen to finish their portions, the former governor grabbed them by their clothes, pulled them up, forced them to rise and follow him. But just before he left, he lingered a little in front of the cow, telling her that she was a very good creature and that she should ask the real god to fulfill her request. The girl was delighted with his words, because she had repeatedly approached the priest with her requests, but he could never fulfill them, and now there was finally a chance that she would get what she wanted. The girl approached our hero and a little embarrassedly asked him if he would agree to fulfill her sincere desire, if he would be so kind to help her after everything that she had previously done for him. The guy gladly agreed to listen to her request, which was that her friend, namely another creature, which she called the royal deer, be released from the dungeon. Of course, given the power and authority of the new god, her sincere wish was immediately fulfilled. The lock on the dungeon was opened and removed immediately. The iron door clanged, then opened, and a pretty blonde girl in a green dress with deer antlers on her head came out of the dark room that was the local dungeon. It turned out that this friend of our cow, who was locked in prison because, according to the former priest, went against the words of God, and now the governor himself was personally releasing her. The girl picked up a shovel and walked towards the laboratory where our heroes were, with the intention of seeing her savior, an old friend. While she was walking along the corridor, the people around her were incessantly discussing the fact that she had been freed, despite her conflict with the priest, rumors about the altar and the new god who had emerged from it. The deer boldly answered them that she did not believe in any god, that there was no god in this world, and these were all deceivers who appeared one after another. However, the people around her absolutely did not listen to what she was telling them, but only ran away in fear in all directions, forcing the royal deer to get angry and quickly go to the altar. The girl was in a hurry because she thought that her friend, a cow named Ellie, was in danger, having fallen under the spell of another liar who calls himself God. And at that moment, when everyone left the laboratory, behind closed doors our hero examined the body of his new acquaintance. To do this, Ellie lay down on a kind of blue table and allowed the guy to examine her from all sides, lift the hem of her dress, touch her limbs, which embarrassed her very much, but she did not dare to resist the will of God, especially since she was very grateful to him. And our hero examined the body of his new acquaintance from all sides and was shocked that people like her could exist in his world at this time. He wondered how this happened, what species crossed to create such animal-like people. Meanwhile, Ellie decided to take advantage of the situation and asked the guy whom she considered the true god about whether her friend's punishment was fair, how he generally treats the royal deer, whether it was true or whether the governor deceived her again. The guy reminded her that he was not actually any god, but just an ordinary guy named Ling Chen, that when they were alone, she could call him by his real name, and not pretend to believe his story. Then they just chatted nicely, discussed various points, looked at the situation that just happened recently with humor, and tried to agree on what to do next. And just outside the doors the royal deer had already arrived, throwing her shovel up and shouting that there was no god and that Ellie should not let herself be offended by this next liar. However, she clearly entered the laboratory at the wrong moment, catching our heroes in a very piquant situation and a pose that could be misunderstood, completely different from what it really was. Of course, the royal deer perceived the situation completely differently from what it really was, which immediately confused the girl, causing her to freeze in place in surprise and bulge her eyes. The young deer blushed, closed her eyes, trying not to look at what was happening, additionally covering them with her hands on top, so that nothing would leak into her memory, because she absolutely did not want to see her friend in such a situation. And the cow only provided additional incentives for embarrassment, because she said that her friend had arrived just in time so that the new god could examine her body too, of course meaning by this phrase simply an examination. This drove the blonde into even greater horror and made her become uneasy red, and even glow with embarrassment, lose the power of speech, just stand with her mouth open and look at what was happening, at how easily her friend perceived the whole situation and did not understand how it was looks from the outside. And the cow, meanwhile, lay calmly on the table, looked at her old friend and with a smile on her face invited her to quickly join her, which only added even more strangeness to this moment. But the guy understood perfectly well how it looked from the outside, so he tried to justify himself to his friend Ellie, saying that she simply misunderstood everything and that everything just looked so strange. But in fact it was not something shameful. However, the embarrassed girl did not want to accept his words at all. His supposed ability of God did not frighten her at all, because she did not believe in it, which only made her angry at this guy for the way he treated her friend the cow, who was too easy on everything reacted. Therefore, the blonde decided to strike first, repelling her friend from the clutches of yet another liar who tried to take advantage of her beautiful body. She scolded our hero terribly, called him the worst words she could know, trying to get him away from the cow so that he could not deceive her and take advantage of her gullibility. The deer did not want to listen to absolutely no excuses and defensive words from Ellie, who tried to explain what was really happening here, that she was not in any danger, that she herself agreed to this and was glad to help the real god, since he only needed to look her body. However, the blonde did not take any words or arguments of her friend seriously, believing that she had already been brainwashed, considering only herself to be right. The girl attacked our hero so quickly that he didn't even have time to do anything, he just stood amazed at the speed of her attack. The deer did not stop attacking the guy, whom she considered a liar, constantly attacking him again and again, trying to hurt him and defeat him as quickly as possible. Lin only had time to dodge and run away from her lightning-fast attacks. He could not use the computer and its help, since he did not want to harm the friend of his cow friend Ellie. Although the deer was embarrassed that the guy did not attack her in return, but only dodged, ran away, and tried to defend himself, however, this did not stop her. Their fight, if you can call it that, did not last so long, because the deer was still a master of her craft. She fired several powerful and particularly fast strikes from both sides, which reached their target after running around the entire laboratory in a circle, after which the proud girl took a few steps back, put her shovel into an improvised sheath, standing over her defeated enemy. Our hero at that moment was lying on the floor, beaten by a young girl, completely passed out. His body was completely covered with bruises and contusions, which obviously would take a very long time to heal. And while our boy was lying on the floor and recovering from a good thrashing, the cow finally managed to convince her friend that he was a really good guy, that he protected her from the Lu gang of robbers who ruled this place earlier. The deer, it seems, even believed his friend after everything that she managed to tell her, and even sincerely began to regret that she had beaten the poor guy so badly, who actually protected the cow while she herself was sitting in prison. However, one question still remained unresolved: what exactly were they doing on that strange table when the blonde entered the room? Because from the outside it really looked a little scary and embarrassing, as if the guy was doing something bad with her friend. But the cow explained that the guy just wanted to look at her body, because he himself had no ears, no tail, no other signs of any race, so he was interested in studying all this carefully. Only after these words did the deer notice that the guy lying on the floor, passed out, really did not have any of these listed signs, which significantly distinguished him from everyone she had ever seen before, which was very strange. She also knew for sure that since this man was so different from everyone else, it meant that he could be a huge hindrance for the priest, because the former Viceroy Lu was used to running everything here, which means he was clearly preparing some kind of plan, and now the heroes would need be doubly wary of him and be ready to attack at any moment.